Hello, historians of Arizona. Welcome back. And let's talk today about Arizona before it really was called that, before it was called Arizona, but the territory that we know of it under Spanish and Mexican rule. Now, like I said, this isn't a place yet, right? The Arizona as we know it, the territory, the state doesn't exist. In fact, it's lumped in with New Mexico. So when historians are looking to find information on Arizona specifically, they can't go into the Spanish archives or the Spanish records and find mentions of Arizona specifically. Instead, they have to look at the Spanish dealings in New Mexico and then try to identify specific locations that are typically around kind of southern Arizona, south of the Gila River, really. And then they know, okay, this particular event occurred in modern day Arizona. We will talk at length about how New Mexico and Arizona were formed and then how they ultimately were divided. And they actually went through two different periods of division right around the American Civil War, but we're not there yet. So today's lecture is going to cover about 200 or so, maybe 300 years of Spanish and Mexican claims to what they called the Northern Frontier. We'll go into depth on some things and then we'll go quickly through others. So this is a combination of depth and breadth today. So let's start with European arrival. Now, Europeans arrived in what they called the New World in the 15th and 16th centuries, kind of depending on what area of the world we're looking at. But when we look at sort of central Mexico, the consolidated patterns of colonization and exploration really occurred in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, before they even arrived, right, they participated in something called the Columbian Exchange. And historians really look at the Columbian Exchange, which we'll talk about in a moment, as this event of trading materials and exchange of people and goods and services that was an exchange from the New World to the Old. But Sheridan actually shows us that there's lots of different ways to look at this era when Europeans contacted the New World. He says, quote, "It was a world perched on the periphery of a periphery, a frontier between the colonial expansion of Europe and the last defiant stand of Native America. Even though they had never been conquered or missionized, the Akmel Odam had been drawn into the European orbit." So he's saying that before the Europeans even arrived, before the Europeans, the Spanish in particular, ever attempted to missionize, colonize, or conquer native peoples, we can see examples of the Columbian Exchange through the Akmil Otham people and their stories. And here's what he means. This is a story reprinted in Sheridan's Arizona. "One cold night in the spring, a Pima at Rosituk was irrigating his wheat field by moonlight. Without thought of enemies, he built a fire to warm himself. This the Apaches saw and came about him in the thicket. Hearing the twigs cracking under their feet, he ran to the village and gave the alarm. The Pimas gathered in sufficient numbers to surround the Apaches, who attempted to reach the hills on their horses. 2 horses stumbled into a gully, and their riders were killed before they could extricate themselves. The others were all followed and all killed." Here's what's fascinating about this. So the Otham people, the Akmila Otham people, they collected histories. Remember last week when I told you, or recently when I told you, that we don't have a lot of written documentation from Native Americans and Native Arizonans? Well, that's not entirely true, because they had ways of recording information through these artifacts called the talking stick. And the oldest incident that can be explained or described on a Pima calendar stick was this incident as described. Okay, great. So it's one of the oldest things we can trace back to Pima history or Akmel Otham history. And here's what Sheridan is pointing out. He says there's no mention of white men in this short narrative, right? We have Otham and Apaches, but we know they were fighting, and that the way that they fought actually demonstrate the Columbian Exchange. What he's saying is, you can look at the Columbian Exchange this way. Now it's named Columbian, right, for Columbus. So Columbus is credited for being among the first explorer to really find his way to what are parts of North and Central America. And with the arrival of Europeans, at the bottom of your screen, you can see come new things. So new things from the quote, old world, different kinds of crops, different kinds of practices, livestock, including cattle, sheep, horses, pigs, different trees and fruits, herbs and spices. And what they then did was they imported these things while exporting others. So they brought all Europeans, not just the Spanish, but the Spanish initiated. They bring materials, they bring goods, they bring crops and supplies to the New World, and then they end up sending things back to the Old World that are new. So pumpkins and turkeys and pineapples and the cacao bean, right? These are things that were in North America, Central America, and South America that did not exist in Europe before European contact. And so they're sending things back to Great Britain, to Spain, to France, etc. But what Sheridan is striking here, and what he's pointing out with the Pima talking stick story, is that the Europeans brought other things with them, including warfare. They brought human beings, human slaves, right? They also brought diseases. So the people in Arizona, like that Otham man and his friends, and the Apaches and their friends, those folks were interacting with each other with influences from the Columbian Exchange. So I want to go back and point out to you, for example, I'm just going to annotate real quick. What he's saying is that you can see European influences, the Columbian Exchange, in this particular story. The first is through the cultivation of wheat. Before the Europeans arrived, the Otham didn't use or grow wheat. This was a European crop. The Apaches as well were riding horses, and the horses were adopted from Europeans. The Spanish brought horses with them to the Americas. So that's what he's pointing out, right? Is that you can start to see the Columbian Exchange before you even see Europeans showing up in Arizona. So the Europeans had quite an impact on Native people. We can find this through, trade, warfare, exchange, violence, but also diseases. So another impact in Arizona that came from the Columbian Exchange is that many people were killed on account of European germs and diseases before they ever even met a white person, before they ever met a Spanish person. So let's talk about Spanish entrada. Let's talk about, when did the conquistadores arrive in Arizona, modern day Arizona? So there's lots of different kind of focuses or nuclei. We can trace the Spanish exploration into the Southwest. So this is the first known one that we have. This is Cabeza de Vaca, who was shipwrecked in 1528 near Texas. So you can kind of see right here where Galveston is. And it's believed that as he and his companions kind of wandered around today's modern day Texas, they possibly crossed into New Mexico and parts of Arizona, but they would have just sort of nicked the southern corner of Arizona. De Vaca was traveling with companions, including this guy who's depicted in this artist rendering called Esteban de Dorantes. You also might see it as Esteban the Moor or Estevanico, yes, with a V. So depending on how you see it spelled, Esteban's a really incredible character in American history. He's truly the first Black person to be in North America. So he is a guide, and he's from North Africa. Regardless of where they went or didn't go, they heard, for sure, we know, tales of great houses and Indian kingdoms throughout the Southwest. And they return to once they are found, they return to talk about their riches and the things they found, including these great cities of gold. So they're followed a little while later by a guy named Fray Marcos de Niza. So you might know of Marcos de Niza High School in Phoenix, or the Marcos de Niza neighborhood near Grant Park in downtown or South Phoenix, depending. So his initial expedition, he goes into Arizona with Esteban. So he uses Esteban as his guide. And Esteban moves ahead and is later killed by Zunis without any recording of what he encountered. So we don't really know what Esteban saw as he was out scouting and guiding de Niza. But de Niza then claims to find Cibola, the city of gold, that he said was greater than Mexico City. He comes back saying, oh man, I just found the most incredible combination of riches, just, a few days ride north of here. And this starts kind of a frenzy in Spanish colonial minds and fascinations. But most historians actually don't think he really ever saw any cities of gold because there's no evidence that these cities existed. So is it possible that he fell upon Canyon de Che, or he saw the what is today the ruins of Mesa Verde? Like maybe, and he thought those were these really wealthy, incredible places. But what was he really looking for, and what did he claim to find? In 1540, Coronado tries to find these cities of gold. At the time, Coronado is the governor of Nueva Galicia, which is in western Mexico. He takes a humongous expedition of 350 men, Europeans, and that's not counting the servants and enslaved people, as well as the 1,300 Native Americans that came with him into Arizona. They are also looking for and fail to find the cities of gold. But something that's pointed out, and I think is important to note here, is that the Spanish really get a rap for being kind of gold, riches, and glory chasers, right? And they are, but they're also looking to establish places where they could grow crops, where they could cultivate great farms and ranches, and where they could really impact the Native American communities. So here's the example of Coronado's route. So we are able to trace Coronado's route into kind of Hopi territory and north of Flagstaff. But then he really does, look how far he gets into the Midwest. He goes all the way to Kansas and through like the northern parts of Texas and the western parts of Oklahoma. But he never finds the city of gold. So his failure to find the cities of gold actually marked the end of European interest in modern day Arizona for at least 40 years. So he comes back and he's like, yeah, Deniza is nuts. Like there's no way this is there. And people basically lose interest in Arizona until Juan de Oñate. So in 1598, he attempts to colonize northern New Mexico. And remember, New Mexico to him is today's present day New Mexico and also today's present day Arizona. So he's probably looking at a similar area as Coronado was, like up here near Flagstaff. But he's also maybe looking right here, kind of look at this edge of modern day Arizona. He describes splendid pastures, fine plains, and excellent land for farming in today's Verde Valley. And later they find silver and water in the desert, which is truly one of the greatest resources Arizona had to offer. So let's look at this period. And you can see that 1700 to 1858, there's a big event that happens in 1820 that impacts the political makeup of Arizona. But other than that, let's look at kind of the evolution of the culture and the character of what we'll call Hispanic Arizona for this particular talk. Now look at this map. So you can see Arizona is right kind of to the top left corner of this map. It's right here. What we call the West or the Southwest was called by the Spanish as the Northern Frontier. And this map is of their what they called the Northern Frontier. So this included most of modern day Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, and in some cases parts of Colorado including. So two big two big communities that are founded. The first is just south of Tucson. The Franciscans and the Jesuits were in the process of founding hundreds of missions in Central and North America. And they ultimately found the first mission in Arizona in 1700 in Tohono O'odham territory. And this is founded by Father Kino. This is the San Xavier del Bac. It's still standing. You can go visit it anytime. It's just south of Tucson. Missionization included building things like churches, places to live, and storage facilities. Its purpose was to convert, but also save souls. This is what they called it, save souls and assimilate indigenous people to the Spanish culture and way of life. So this is the first European settlement in modern day Arizona by way of being a mission. But there's another territory in Arizona that's really interesting, and that's Tubac. So in 1752, it's founded by the Spanish crown, but it had already been a contiguously populated place. The crown founded this following a previous O'odham uprising, which ended in Tubac. This is the first permanent Spanish settlement in modern day Arizona that was established by the crown as a kind of a colonial holding. It is the northernmost Spanish outpost of what they called the Northern Frontier, and it is a melting pot of Spanish, Native American, and new groups who were identified within La Casta. Okay, so who are the people living in this area at the time? We talked a little bit recently about sort of three major Native American civilizations that were living in the Arizona territories at the time. But what about the Apaches? Let's talk about what they called Apacharia. The origins of the Apache are somewhat mysterious. We know they are related to the Athabascan-speaking people of Alaska and Western Canada, and we know that through linguistic studies. So the words that they said, the tone and dictation is connected to the Athabascan-speaking cultures. They have similarities in terms of linguistics that we can trace between the Apache and the Navajo. We think they probably migrated into the American Southwest long after 1000 CE, so long after those prehistoric civilizations we looked at recently. It's possible that they arrived as late as the 14th or 15th centuries, so right around the same time as European arrival. They scattered across a large territory. You can see that in the map as I showed, like they're really just sort of distributed throughout portions of Alaska, Canada, and modern-day Southwest into Texas. And we really know that they divided into small nomadic bands, and they were then in turn divided into even smaller local bands. So they had a loose structure of small organizations. They lived in tents, they hunted bison and other game, and they used large dogs to pull sleds loaded with food and personal possessions. You know, those are their Apaches. Well, the Apaches are among the most famous of America's native Indians or native indigenous people. And we know this in part because of their relationships with the Spanish. So early Spanish explorers, like I showed you, we know that they encountered several of the bands. They may not have called them Apaches at the time or seen them as one big group. But as I said, with the missions, for example, Spain really tried to dominate the people of modern day Arizona. And really this disrupted the Apaches organization. They quickly then learned to trade with the Spanish. They acquired horses, they improved their ability and their mobility, and they were raiders. So they would steal from each other. This was part of their way of life. But when New Mexico Territory, which included Arizona, became a Spanish colony in 1598, hostilities between the Apache bands and the Spanish increased rapidly. They were often friendly with the Spanish, but also difficult for the Spanish to subdue. There were lots of conflicts that we can trace historically into the 19th century, so into the 1800s. Mostly what we know in terms of their Arizona claim would be like up to 1821, their homeland was eventually claimed by the Mexican government as the successor to the earlier Spanish claims to the region. We'll talk about this in just a moment. And the Apache were known warriors and guerrilla fighters. They defended their mountain strongholds against any Mexican or Spanish attempts to conquer them. Sheridan writes, the difference between raiding and warfare in Apache language shed considerable light on the structure of Apache society itself. There were no hereditary kings, no hereditary priests, no formal councils of government. Unlike the Spaniards, the Apaches did not think of themselves as a nation or an empire. They saw themselves as local groups that were independent of one another. They had a huge influence on the northern frontier, on today's Southwest. And you can see in this map, you know, here's the northern frontier and here's Phoenix. So that gives you a pretty good vantage point of where we're talking about their influence. Here's Flagstaff. You remember your map challenge? The Apaches' dominance throughout the White Mountains in particular. So you know where the White Mountains are, that's up by the Mogollon Rim. This cut the Spanish off from connecting their settlements in New Mexico and Alta California. So this is the northern frontier as it's divided into viceroyalties. So if the Spanish are really claiming, you know, say New Mexico, and they're also claiming over here, California, but the Apache are in their way, right? That's going to cause an issue for them dominating the entire of the Southwest. The Apache had incredible horseback skills and warfare tactics, which made them hard for the Spanish to conquer, even though they were constantly influencing each other. And Spanish attempts to settle in modern-day Arizona were difficult at best throughout the 18th century. So how does it transform? How do we go from a Spanish northern frontier to a Mexican northern frontier, and then very quickly thereafter to an Anglo-Western frontier? Well, it happens with Mexican independence. In 1821, Mexico claimed all of Spain's northern frontier, including New Mexico Territory, which includes Arizona. As a response to this independence, Mexico, one of the first things they do as a country is open up trade relationships with America. It was not even a year later that American trappers and white farmers began moving into New Mexico lands, basically squatting, basically claiming territory and land from the Mexican government. And it really wasn't long after that. It took about 30 years from Mexico getting independence until they went to war with the United States over the territory of the Southwest. The first white Americans to end up in Arizona are trappers. So these are like they're like a loosely organized bands of men who were misfits, businessmen, hunters. They're really romanticized in American history, but they actually weren't as romantic as we think. They're nomadic, right? And they're out there searching for beaver pelts. So they're trapping beavers and sending the furs back to Europe. Well, they fall out of favor pretty quickly when European tastes change and people no longer want to buy fur and they end up wanting to buy silk. The next thing that happens are a series of land grants. So Spain established colonies or Spain established territories through viceroyalties, but also through land grants, meaning they would kind of give portions of land away to Spanish citizens and the elite royalty. Mexico continued this tradition just for the first, 30 years or so. And sometimes what this meant was that white Americans were able to lay claim to spaces in New Mexico, in the northern frontier, from even though it was owned by Mexico. And then here's really where things change. In 1849, gold is discovered in California. So this is all happening at the same time. Mexico has recently established its independence from Spain. Spain has pulled out its involvement in the Southwest. And now you have Americans who want access to fur, water, farming, and eventually gold. In order to get from one side of the country to the other, to get to the California gold, you have to either go by sea or you have to cross modern day Arizona. So this is why we eventually begin to see that America and Mexico go to war over the modern day Southwest. So the US-Mexico War begins in 1858, and we will talk about this at another time. So Sheridan writes, Mexican Arizona limped into the 1850s, maligned by gold seekers, lashed by Apache raids, ravaged by a cholera epidemic that broke out in 1851, and the result was a bitter conflict at a time when the survival of Mexican Arizona hung on a very thin thread. Now you have a challenge. I want you to do this. I want you to review today's lecture and select one of these topics that I just discussed. So any of those topics on the left, you can discuss. Don't pick the Mexican-American War because we haven't talked about that yet. And the things about American encroachment, we'll get to that later as well. Once you've picked your topic, I want you to conduct a library search for one article about your selected topic. Now, you have to use library sources. Please do not do a Google search. Use the library. You can share your article with the class and answer these questions when ready. What is the full citation of your article? What does this article explain about your selected topic? And finally, in your opinion, which is based on your research, what was the significance of your selected top on Arizona history? So I'll give you an example. You're going to go to the library website and you can either use that one search tool right here, or you can click on popular academic databases. I'm going to just use one search and I'm going to look up Mexican-American War. You can't do this one because we haven't gotten here yet, but let's say that's what we want to do. Now you have to find a full article. So these are just like this is all the resources they have. So I want to make sure that I can access it online. I don't want to have to go to the library to see it. And I want an article, not a book. So I'm going to select journal article and I'm going to select reference because sometimes the references are really good. All right. So gender, soldiering, and citizenship in the Mexican-American War. Okay, in the name of civilization and with the Bible in their hand, religion in the Mexican-American War, the constant recurrence of such atrocities. Let's see, any of these interest me? How about this one, the Dead March? Now, sometimes your sources aren't going to connect automatically for you. It depends on your firewall and the device you're using. If you're logged into the internet or into the library rather. Okay, so I think let's look at the full text. Why didn't that let me? Okay, so you can click on the actual title, which I did. And look at this. This is a nice long article. So check the requirements in the actual assignment to make sure that you're meeting the expectations. But look at this. This is a nice book, book review, basically. So this woman, Maria Angela Diaz, she's reviewing this book, The Dead March, A History of the Mexican-American War. So I could use this, but it might be a little bit too specific, right? Are we really looking for a book review? I kind of want more of a general story or general definition of the Mexican-American War. So let's go back and see if there's something else that interests me. What if I were to uncheck the journal article and just pick reference? Okay, let's try this one. Now, sometimes these links don't always work, so don't get frustrated. But sometimes just like the libraries, hard to navigate. The Mexican-American War reference. Okay, perfect. This gives me a nice overview of the Mexican-American War. Now I'm going to have to read this to answer my questions because Dr. C wants me to share my article. Let's see what else I need to do. Okay, conduct a library search for one article about your selected topic. Done. Now I need to share the article with the class and answer these questions. What's the full citation of my article? What does this article explain about my selected topic? So that's for me to discuss. Like I'm going to read this article and I'm going to say, this is what my article is about. And then I have to answer, in my opinion, what is the significance of, for me, it's the Mexican-American War on Arizona history. Okay, so that requires me to read the article and then discuss it, tell you all about it. I don't need you to copy and paste. I don't need you to find, some Wikipedia entry. I want you to find an article, discuss the article, and then tell me what you think it explains. Now, how to get a citation for your article? This is partly why I love sending you to the library. You can just click on Cite and you can copy and paste, right? So you can click on Cite, copy, and then paste that into your discussion. The other way to cite, if you don't want to do that, is basically look for the big four, as I said. You want who wrote it, so you want to know who wrote this article. You want to know when it was written. You want to know what the title is, and you want to know the location. Now, you can use this location or you can use the URL. But I need all four. I want to know the author, the title, the date, and the location. All right, good luck. I'm excited to see your articles. Now, one caveat, you may not choose the same article as someone else. So you can choose the same topic. Let's say you want to do Tubok and somebody else does Tubok, that's fine. But you can't reference the same article as someone else. So scroll through the discussion board before you post to make sure that you're not doing any duplicates, because priority is given to the student who posts first. All right, everybody, thank you for everything today. I look forward to seeing what you find.